CBS News 24/7. I'm Juliette Goodrich. We are following two major events happening any moment now. At the White House, President Trump is set to sign an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. Trump will sign the order in the East Room with special guests including Florida Governor Rick DeSantis and Texas Governor Greg Abbott. And in Maryland, the NTSB is set to give an update on the investigation into the deadly Baltimore bridge collapse. You may remember almost a year ago, a cargo ship crashed into that bridge, causing it to fall into the water. 6 construction workers died that day. We will bring you both events live on CBS News 24/7. But we begin on the White House, where President Trump is signing an executive order to begin dismantling the Department of Education. So joining him are several high-profile guests, including 4 state governors and the Commissioner of Education. So let's take a quick look at what the Department of Education does, how much it costs, and how much dismantling it could impact you. So last year, the Department of Education's budget was $286 billion. So that's 4% of the federal budget. Some of those funds get distributed like this: billions for high poverty K through 12 schools, $15.5 billion to help cover education for children with disabilities, and $1.6 trillion for federal student loan programs. CBS News senior White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs has the very latest on this executive order and more about the Trump administration's guidance about what would happen if these programs are dismantled. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
So let's begin with kind of the dismantling. The DOE would need to approve from Congress, right, to make that happen. So what path forward to make this all come about?
Right. So we don't have a copy of the actual executive order yet. So until we read those details, it's really difficult to discern precisely what it would do. But from having conversations with officials here at the White House, what I do know is that it's a reduction of the Department of Education, not necessarily shutting it down or dismantling it, even though we might hear some of those talking points. Essentially, the 3 main things that the Education Department does will be preserved, and that's student loans, which includes Pell Grants, that's money to educate students with disability, and that's money for low-income schools. We're told that the Trump administration is preserving those 3 things. Those will remain intact. And the student loans were the particularly tricky part. That's why this EO has been delayed. We've known about it for a few weeks now. It was on the docket for the president to sign it, and it kept getting postponed. There was a little bit of complication with where those student loans were going to move. For now, the main things that the Education Department will stay at the Education Department. The big changes that we will see are they're doing things with what they call DEI. They're doing things with research. They're trying to take back control, conservative control, in a way that pleases the Trump administration. Because remember, the genesis for some of this idea to reduce the size of the Department of Education was born from COVID during those school shutdowns. And Jules, one of the governors that you mentioned that's here, Ron DeSantis, I just saw him coming in through the White House gates. Also, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. Those were 2 of the governors that fought to keep their classrooms open for in-person instruction during COVID. And there have been other battles that conservatives have had with the federal government about education. So this is not just a symbolic victory. I'm not saying that. There are real reductions in staff, but for the most part, the main things will be preserved.
All right. So we're waiting for that news conference, and thank you so much for that information and standing by. We'll certainly wait for President Trump to give his notice on what may happen with the Department of Education. Thank you so much, Jennifer Jacobs. Appreciate it. All right. The Justice Department may invoke state secrets privilege to block a federal judge from getting certain details about 2 deportation flights. The deportees were removed under the Alien Enemies Act. It allows non-citizens to be deported without due process. So the DOJ says the flights did not violate a court order and accused the judge of encroaching on the executive branch's power. CBS News Department of Justice correspondent Scott McFarland joining us now. Scott, thanks so much for being here. What could happen if state secrets privilege is invoked?
The Department of Justice is going to have to show this judge that it was necessary and that it was ordered by somebody specific with access to the president's cabinet. There was a 12 p.m. Eastern Time deadline today for the Department of Justice to answer the judge's questions about those deportations last Saturday. When did the planes take off? When did they clear U.S. airspace? When did they land? And why was his order for the plane to turn around not complied with? The answers were given by the Department of Justice to some of the judge's questions today. We don't know what they said. They were filed with the judge, not publicly, but we know what the judge has to say after. He wants to know who ordered that these state secrets be invoked to avoid following the judge's orders in court today.
All right, and the
we'll get some answers potentially tomorrow or potentially next week.
Oh, yeah, Scott, absolutely. DOJ also targeting people who vandalize Tesla dealerships. So what legal action would they face?
Yeah, a series of cases have been filed over the past few weeks, and the Attorney General put out a news release today announcing that the cases are there, that they've been there for some time. We dug into one case in South Carolina where a man is accused of deliberately setting afire a Tesla charging station area. There's a property crime charge that's been levied against him. The Department of Justice has said they're also going to pursue potentially domestic terror charges when people intentionally set afire Teslas or Tesla infrastructure. That's not really a charge you can bring, domestic terrorism, but it is something they can bring at sentencing to try to enhance the prison terms people would face if they plead guilty or are convicted of these types of cases. They can try to enhance the prison terms by seeking a terror enhancement from the judge.
Scott McFarland. Scott, thank you. On to breaking news now. A federal judge now blocking Doge from accessing personal information through the Social Security Administration and will also have to delete any personal identifiable data that they may have. In the memorandum, she wrote, the Doge team is essentially engaged in a fishing expedition at the SSA in search of a fraud epidemic based on little more than suspicion. All right, let's get to Wall Street, where the closing bell rang just moments ago. So we're watching where things landed one day after the Federal Reserve decided to leave interest rates unchanged. So take a look. The Dow is in red territory right now. Here's our interactive stock market heat map. This is brought to you by FinViz. So it shows the top 500 stocks, all of this in real time. Red, obviously indicating the stock is down. Green means it's up. And the size of the box, that represents the market cap. So CBS News contributor J.D. Durkin joining us live now. J.D., thanks for being here. Let's talk about tariffs. From tariffs to interest rates, shall we? And also the uncertainty around the U.S. economy weighing in Americans' minds right now, certainly for investors.
Yeah, no doubt about it. By the way, that heat map is the way to our heart here at the New York Stock Exchange. I love it, and it gives us such a good indication of what investors are trying to digest today, Juliet, one day after not just the decision from the Federal Open Markets Committee, but really the additional comments at the press conference from Jerome Powell, the chairman of the central bank. And I think trying to make heads or tails of it, because obviously we did have the decision of no decision from the Fed, and Chairman Powell being very cautious, indicating there's a lot of uncertainty and skepticism about the degree to which the Trump administration's tariffs may ultimately be inflationary, yet at the very same time indicating that the central bank does believe there are going to be not one but two short-term interest rate cuts between now and the end of the year. A very kind of choppy series of sessions here on Wall Street today. A lot of volatility over the course of the day. We kind of seesawed back and forth in positive to negative territory, and it sets the stage for tomorrow. There's a lot going on here on Wall Street tomorrow, including what's known as the S&P 500 rebalance. We're going to have some key names like DoorDash and Williams-Sonoma that a lot of our viewers are probably familiar with. They're set to be added to the S&P 500 tomorrow, and that and a few other things mean a lot of volatility as investors still try and digest exactly what this means for the path moving forward for the state of GDP, the American economy, and really the path forward for short-term interest rates, which impact all of us.
Yeah, and JD, at this hour, we're waiting President Trump. He's expected to dismantle the Department of Education with just the swipe of a pen. So a lot of people have questions, certainly about what this means for student loan borrowers. Can you kind of break that down?
Yeah, no surprise here that experts are really kind of calling this the worst case scenario for a lot of federal student loan borrowers. More than 40 million Americans have federal student loans. And if you look at the portfolio of the Department of Education, it's more than $1.5 trillion. For perspective, that's about the market cap of Meta, also known as Facebook. And that's the 7th largest company in the world. This executive order, as your correspondents have laid out, is expected to significantly gut the number of employees, and that's expected to make a lot of things much more difficult for federal student loan borrowers. Processing payments is going to be more difficult. Managing defaults is going to be a lot more difficult. Even things that sound kind of simple, but getting customer service help to answer the phones at the Department of Education is expected to be a lot more difficult. In terms of news you could use, Juliet, for people watching at home, if you have previously applied for student loan forgiveness, that request will probably be put on hold, and certainly the courts will have a lot to litigate in the days and weeks ahead after today's executive order.
Yeah, JD, that's helpful information. Okay, let's talk about tariffs. We're kind of learning to take these threats on a day-by-day basis, correct? So the EU is now saying it's actually going to delay retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. Does that leave room for the president to strike a deal?
I mean, it certainly could. I mean, I think the wait and see approach is both what we heard from Jerome Powell at the Fed yesterday, and it's what we're hearing from other countries as well. April 2nd is really the key date, I think, for Wall Street and for all Americans to pay attention to. President Trump has called April 2nd Liberation Day, but it's basically these retaliatory tit-for-tat tariffs that are expected to go into place. The announcement out of the EU and the European Commission, the kind of governing body of the EU, is to kind of wait and see how those April 2nd retaliatory tariffs play themselves out and how do they want to counter-negotiate from there. But you're talking about significant tariffs on key goods that are made in the United States that then get exported to other countries. American whiskey, American poultry, American beer, motorcycles, things that are consumed by people in other countries, they're going to be a lot more expensive to export. And there's some key names that we follow in the financial markets, like Harley-Davidson stock, which, believe it or not, is down about 14% from the start of the year. Diageo stock, which is the parent company to names like Johnny Walker and Guinness, that stock is also under significant pressure. So it's a wait-and-see approach. It's a knee-jerk reactionary stock market. And it's a good reminder that any little announcement out of the White House has significant repercussions for American consumers, but especially for American investors across the major market indexes.
JD Durkin, JD, thank you so much. All right, a live look at the White House, where any moment now President Trump is expected to sign an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. It is important to note the government agency cannot be fully shut down without congressional approval. We will bring you the president's remarks live on CBS News 24/7. And from blizzard conditions, tornadoes and destructive wildfires, severe weather, it slams states across the U.S. A look at the damage and the cleanup efforts underway next. You are watching CBS News 24/7. A live look at the White House, where any moment now President Trump is expected to sign an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. Several Republican senators will be there to mark today's event, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. We will bring you the president's remarks live as soon as he starts. All right, let's get right to Maryland, where the NTSB is giving an update on the Baltimore bridge collapse. So let's listen in right now.
Thank you for joining us. Next week marks 1 year since the striking of the Dolly container ship with the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. The bridge subsequently collapsed into the Patapsco River, killing 6 construction crew members and injuring another, as well as 1 person on board the vessel. I want to once again extend our deepest sympathies to those who lost loved ones or were injured in this terrible tragedy. Today, we're issuing 4 urgent safety recommendations to bridge owners, the Federal Highway Administration, the United States Coast Guard, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Specifically, we're urging 30 owners of 68 bridges in 19 states to perform a vulnerability assessment of their bridge's risk of catastrophic collapse from a vessel collision.
Let's get to our breaking news correspondent, Chanel Call, in the CBS newsroom in New York. Chanel, thanks for joining us. What stood out to you at this live news conference by the NTSB?
Well, the timing here is so key, Jules. You mentioned this has been 1 year since the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed, and today the NTSB chair, Jennifer Homendy, said the NTSB found the Key Bridge, which you'll remember collapsed after being struck by the container ship Dolly on March 26th of last year, was, get this, almost 30 times greater than the acceptable risk threshold for critical or essential bridges. This, according to some guidance that's established by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. So a lot to get through in this press release. I'm just going through it right now. But we know that this incident had inspired a pretty broad investigation by the NTSB. And today, Homendy issued this warning, what she called an urgent safety recommendation for 68 other bridges in 19 states across the country. So these bridges, Jules, the NTSB says, basically pass over waterways which frequently carry big cargo vessels, just like the Dolly, which was involved in the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. And the board is now calling for 30 different entities that own and operate bridges just like that to specifically look at how vulnerable they are to collapse if in case there is a collision. Again, I'm just going through this press release that came into our newsroom right now, but there are some notable landmark bridges named here, including the Golden Gate.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are bridges that people commute over each and every day. Specifically, here we are in the Bay Area. I go over the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge. So did the NTSB give any lining as to what needs to be done, any silver lining that what needs to be done to make these bridges safer?
Well, at this point, they're putting forth this recommendation to those 30 owners and operators of those bridges. And what they want to see here is some recommendations around vulnerability and risk. The situation that we saw ensue about a year ago at the Francis Scott Key Bridge had to do with the Dolly hitting a pier. And so what the NTSB wants to see is a closer look at what would happen if that were to happen, that is, at any of these 68 bridges across the country. So essentially they are looking for answers.
All right, Chanel Call. Chanel, thank you for outlining that in the NTSB news conference today. Appreciate it. All right, President Trump is expected to sign an executive order aimed at dismantling the Department of Education, a government agency that cannot be fully shut down without the help of Congress. Many educators are not happy about the move. David Goldberg, president of the California Teachers Association, joining us now to talk about this executive order. David, thank you. We're just minutes away from the news conference, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before we need to go to that news conference by President Trump. But first and foremost, how are you feeling just sitting there right now, knowing that possibly it could be dismantled, part of the DOE?
I'm terrified. I'm angry and I'm upset. Folks, beyond the headlines, look, public education is either a blue or a red issue. What impacts to special ed students impacts us all. Impacts to rural students impacts us all. Making it harder for kids to go to university on Pell Grants impacts us all. And we are frustrated that the Trump-Musk administration keeps trying to balance budgets on the backs of working people, special ed students, poor students, rural students. It's beyond belief that this is the way that they're trying to keep dismantling everything that serves the public while they keep preparing for tax breaks for billionaires. It's frustrating, and it's something we're going to continue to figure out how we continue to push back both nationally and in California.
Yeah, I hear it in your voice. I see it in your eyes. I get it. But I'm curious, what would that mean for you personally as a special education teacher for your students? Should there be cuts? How would that affect you and your classroom?
Well, in California, by the way, we've already gone through decades of disinvestment in public education, so we're already on survival mode. But just the threat of cutting more resources to most vulnerable students has already sent shockwaves across public education in California. We have 2,400 layoff notices that have gone out so far as of last week. That is just, when we're already on survival mode, any cuts to the most vulnerable students, to special education students, that's going to deeply impact families, and it deeply impacts educators. We're trying to meet the most basic needs of our students. And when that gets harder, that's just heartbreaking for us. And it's something, we cannot stand by and let this happen. We're going to continue to need to put pressure around our Congress people in California, and also keep standing up to the Trump-Musk administration's desire to somehow balance the budgets on the backs of working people. It's unconscionable and something we can't back down from at all.
All right, David Goldberg, president of the California Teachers Association. I know that you speak for many other teachers as well. What other classes and courses might be dismantled? We're also hearing that it may not affect student loans and grants of that nature. Is that any glimmer of hope there?
We have absolutely no idea what's going to be impacted. They're running this like a Ponzi scheme. They're frankly part of cutting the Department of Education. They're the folks who would tell us what's being cut. So we will have no idea to verify anything. And I have no faith in administration that has been dead set around cutting all services to the public, whether it's public parks, public resources. So I have no faith whatsoever. I do know that as a parent of students in public education, and I know parents across the board around who are special ed parents, that these funding took decades and decades and decades of struggle to make sure our most vulnerable students got what they deserve. And anyone who puts that in jeopardy, that is someone who has to be stopped. It is unconscionable and unfair, frankly, for any student that impacts us all.
David Goldberg, president of the California Teachers Association, thank you for your time. And as I'm looking at the monitors right now, President Trump is about to speak. Let's listen in.
I just want to announce that I signed a proclamation a few moments ago honoring the 250th anniversary of Patrick Henry's famous speech to the Second Virginia Convention, in which he declared very well-known, very famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." Has anyone heard the phrase? I think most of you have. And moments ago, I also signed an executive order to dramatically increase production of critical minerals and rare earths. It's a big thing in this country. And as you know, we're also signing agreements in various locations to unlock rare earths and minerals and lots of other things all over the world. But in particular, Ukraine, we're doing very well with regard to Ukraine and Russia. And one of the things we are doing is signing a deal very shortly with respect to rare earths with Ukraine, which they have tremendous value in rare earth, and we appreciate that. And we spoke yesterday with, as you know, President Putin and President Zelensky, and we would love to see that come to an end, and I think we're doing pretty well in that regard. So hopefully we can save thousands of people a week from dying. That's what it's all about. They're dying so unnecessarily, and I believe we'll get it done. We'll see what happens, but I believe we'll get it done. Today we take a very historic action that was 45 years in the making. In a few moments, I will sign an executive order to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education once and for all. And it sounds strange, doesn't it? Department of Education, we're going to eliminate it. And everybody knows it's right. And the Democrats know it's right, and I hope they're going to be voting for it, because ultimately it may come before them. But everybody knows it's right, and we have to get our children educated. We're not doing well with the world of education in this country, and we haven't for a long time. And we're pleased to be joined today by the woman who I chose because she's an extraordinary person, and hopefully she will be our last Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. Linda, thank you. Thank you very much. That's another interesting statement. It's an interesting opening, right? But it's true, and it's been amazing how popular this has been. I tell people that this is what I'm doing today, and they say, oh, it's about time. Everybody says it. Republicans and Democrats have said it. They're all saying it. Also with us are some terrific people. Governors Greg Abbott. Greg, thank you very much. Governor Ron DeSantis, thank you very much, Ron. Mike Braun, congratulations on your victory, Mike. That was a big one. Mike DeWine, thank you very much, Mike. Jeff Landry. Jeff, thank you very much, Jeff. Bill Lee, thank you. Governors, all governors. Brad Little. Brad, thank you very much. Where are you, Brad? Hi, Brad. Jim Pylan, thank you very much, Jim. And Kim Reynolds. These are all people very interested in education. And I even see Dan Patrick over there, my friend Dan Patrick. We're joined also by Representatives Tim Walberg and Virginia Fox, Rick Allen, Michael Rulli, and again, Dan Patrick. Thank you very much, Dan. You've been a great friend of ours. And State Attorneys General Ken Paxton. Ken, I see you there. Andrew Bailey. Andrew, what a job you've done, Andrew. You have some good cases going. You've done a great job. Thank you very much. And co-founder of Moms for Liberty, Tiffany Justice. She's been a hard worker. Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. When President Carter created the Federal Education Department in 1979, it was opposed by members of his own cabinet, as well as the American Federation of Teachers, the New York Times editorial board, and the famed Democrat Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. History has proven them right, absolutely right. After 45 years, the United States spends more money on education by far than any other country, and spends likewise by far more money per pupil than any country, and it's not even close. But yet we rank near the bottom of the list in terms of success. It's an amazing stat. Those are two stats you don't want: the most money spent per pupil, and you're at the bottom of the list. And that's where we are, like it or not, and we've been there for a long time. 70% of 8th graders are not proficient in either reading or in math. 70%. 40% of 4th graders lack even basic reading skills, can't read. Students in our public elementary and middle schools score worse in reading today than when the department opened, by a lot. In Baltimore, 40% of the high schools have 0 students who can do basic mathematics. Not even the very simplest of mathematics. I said, give me your definition of basic, and they're talking about like adding a few numbers together. Despite these breathtaking failures, the department's discretionary budget has exploded by 600% in a very short period of time, and it employs bureaucrats in buildings all over Washington, D.C. And as a former real estate person, I will tell you, I ride through the streets of Washington and it says Department of Education, Department of Education. I said, how do you fill those buildings? It's crazy what's happened over the years. I'm pleased to report that after offering these federal employees 2 generous buyout options, and they were very generous, and they're good people, but they were very generous. My administration has initiated a reduction in force, and we're already cutting numbers that were really surprising to a lot, that we were able to do it so successfully. And we've cut the number of bureaucrats in half. 50% have taken office, which is great. Thank you. Under the action I'm taking today, a small handful of Democrats and others that we have employed for a long time, and there are some Republicans, but not too many, I have to be honest with you. But the department's useful functions, and such as, and they're in charge of them: Pell Grants, Title I funding, resources for children with disabilities and special needs will be preserved, fully preserved. They're all going to be so. If you look at the Pell Grants, it's supposed to be a very good program. Title I funding and resources for children with special disabilities and special needs, they're going to be preserved in full and redistributed to various other agencies and departments that will take very good care of them. And that's very important to Linda, I know, and it's very important to all of us. But beyond these core necessities, my administration will take all lawful steps to shut down the department. We're going to shut it down, and shut it down as quickly as possible. It's doing us no good. We want to return our students to the states where just some of the governors here are so happy about this. They want education to come back to them, to come back to the states, and they're going to do a phenomenal job. You know, if you look, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, I have to tell you, I give them a lot of credit. China's top 10. And so we can't now say that bigness is making it impossible to educate, because China is very big. But you have countries that do a very good job in education. And I really believe, like some of the governors here today, from states that run very, very well, including a big state like Texas, but states that run very well are going to have education that will be as good as Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and those top, Finland, those top countries that do so well with education. I think they'll do every bit as well. And what do you think about that, Governor? Do you agree? I think so. Ron, do you agree? I think so. Florida? Iowa? That's right. I really believe that. They'll be as good as any of them. And then you'll have some laggards, and we'll work with them. And we can all tell you who the laggards will be right now, probably, but let's not get into that. But we'll work with them, and we're going to make them, they'll do a job. I think they'll do a job, and they'll go to sections of the state. For instance, New York, you'll have a Manhattan, and you'll have a Suffolk County, and you'll have Nassau County, and you'll have Westchester County. You'll do 4 or 5 or 6 of them. You have upstate New York, and those counties, I think, are going to do very well. And I think ultimately Manhattan should do very well. But we'll break it down into sections, and I think it'll be really, really good. And they're going to be probably the tougher ones, but I think they have a chance to do really well. But we're going to be returning education very simply back to the states where it belongs, and this is a very popular thing to do, but much more importantly, it's a common sense thing to do, and it's going to work. Absolutely, it's going to work. And I can tell you from dealing with the governors and others in the state, they want it so badly. They want to take their children back and really teach their children individually. Probably the cost will be half, and the education will be maybe many, many times better. So we look forward to this. I want to just make one little personal statement. Teachers, to me, are among the most important people in this country, and we're going to take care of our teachers. And I don't care if they're in the union or not in the union. That doesn't matter. But we're going to take care of our teachers, and I believe the states will take actually better care of them than they are taken care of right now. They'll work all sorts of systems and even merit systems. Those great teachers are going to be maybe a little bit better rewarded, or maybe that's the way it should be, but the states are going to make that decision. But we're going to love and cherish our teachers along with our children, and they're going to work with the parents, and they're going to work with everybody else, and it's going to be an amazing thing to watch, and it's really going to be something special. And Linda, you're presiding over something that's so important, and you're going to do a fantastic job, just like you have your whole life. I know your whole life I've been watching you. I've been watching you for a long time. She's had nothing but success. So it's tremendous to have you, and hopefully you won't be there too long, but we're going to find something else for you, Linda, okay? So this will conclude what we are talking about with respect to our most cherished group of people, and that's our children. We want to have our children well educated. We want them to love going to school. We have examples of it. Look at those beautiful, bright-eyed faces. They are so smart. They're so smart. And with that, I'm going to come down, and we're going to sign a very important document, and we're going to be on our way. People have wanted to do this for many, many years, for many, many decades. And I don't know, no president ever got around to doing it, but I'm getting around to doing it, so thank you very much. Should I do this? I was very lucky. I signed another document that turned out to be very good for the country, and I said, let's use that same pen. I don't know, is anybody superstitious? Ron, are you superstitious? Let's use that same pen. come up just to say. Very important, big factor here. Good luck.
All right, you're looking at live news conference there of the president just signing the executive order to dismantle the education department. We had expected this news conference. He signed it, and he made it clear that he wants to bring education back to the states. And as you can see, he had even some students there sitting at desks as this unfolded. So right now, the Trump administration is going to be giving guidance about what would happen now that the DOE is dismantled. And keep in mind, he still needs full approval of the Congress to make this happen. So again, you're looking at live pictures from the White House. President Trump just signed the order to dismantle the education department. What does this mean for special education? What does this mean for loans? What does this mean for Pell Grants? We're going to break it down with our correspondents next. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Nearly 1 year after a cargo ship struck the Baltimore Francis Scott Key Bridge, triggering its collapse and killing 6 people, the NTSB issues an urgent safety recommendation. It's warning dozens of other bridges across the country that have not been assessed for their risk of collapse in the case of a similar accident. Let's listen in.
Today, we're issuing 4 urgent safety recommendations to bridge owners, the Federal Highway Administration, the United States Coast Guard, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Specifically, we're urging 30 owners of 68 bridges in 19 states to perform a vulnerability assessment of their bridge's risk of catastrophic collapse from a vessel collision, determine whether they need to implement countermeasures to reduce vulnerability, report their findings to the NTSB, and if warranted, implement a comprehensive risk reduction plan that includes, at a minimum, short and long-term strategies to reduce the probability of a bridge collapse from a vessel collision.
All right, so that was a news conference you had just heard from the National Transportation Safety Board talking about bridges that need to be checked over. They're not safe, including 68 of them, and most notably the Golden Gate Bridge and other bridges throughout the United States. So we're going to check in on what that means and talk to our key transportation investigator in just a minute. But first, President Trump just signed an executive order aimed at dismantling the Department of Education, a move that can't be complete without congressional approval. He said special education services would not be touched. But some families are worried about what would happen to funding without the DOE. Nancy Cordes spoke to a family in Baltimore that relies on therapy programs at their school.
How does it typically feel inside of a greenhouse?
Hope Katz-Zogby is a 7th grader in Baltimore. She has Down syndrome, but the speech therapy and occupational therapy she receives on site enable her to attend her local charter school.
She does a reading pullout every day. She gets extra help in math.
Hope's mom, Liz Zogby, says the extra support is only possible thanks to a $15 billion program at the Department of Education. It helps states cover the cost of educating students with disabilities.
She's benefited from being in an inclusive classroom, and I think her classmates and her teachers have benefited from her being there as well.
You're saying she's going to need to operate in the wider world at some point.
Absolutely.
And so this is giving her some of the
tools.
The mother says she's very worried about what would happen to those programs if the Department of Education was dismantled.
I think parents all over the country are terrified by that prospect. It takes a lot and some extra to do right by a disabled kid. And it's exhausting for our families to imagine that our government will pull the rug out from underneath the supports and services that our kids need to be successful in their schools.
We are following the dismantling of the Department of Education. Let's go now to our CBS News senior White House reporter, Jennifer Jacobs, with the latest on what we just heard by the executive order that was signed by President Trump.
Right. It is signed now. It's done. And Linda McMahon, the education secretary, stood right next to the president and smiled after he signed it. And he said he's hoping that Linda McMahon is the last education secretary that the United States has. Whether that's the case is unclear. We still haven't seen a copy of the actual written language, but the president did say in the East Room that some of the essential functions of the Education Department will be preserved, and that includes, as he said, it's the funding for low-income schools, it's the student loans and Pell Grants, and it's the funding for children with special needs and disabilities. He said those will be redistributed to other agencies and departments. Now, I'm told from White House officials that this EO that he just signed doesn't do that quite yet, that those things will be preserved at the Department of Education for now. So we'll have to read that over. But for now, I think everything's still at the Education Department. But the president just told us that those will eventually be redistributed to other agencies.
What does he mean when he says, let's bring the schools back to the states? And what does that look like?
So what the president has been saying is he feels like the Education Department is bloated, there's too much bureaucracy, there's too much regulation. So I think this is more like an effort to try to get those state governors to have a little bit more control, to reduce the number of federal employees here who are telling the states what to do. So some of the functions will be preserved, others are being eliminated. It's all meant to give those governors more control. The president said he predicted that education is going to improve in the United States and that it's going to be as good as countries such as Norway and Sweden and Finland. He said he wants to take care of the teachers, and it doesn't matter if they're members of the union or not union members. He said, we love teachers, we want to take care of them all. But I can tell you, we have seen a statement from the education union, and they have said that they are going to fight this.
Were you surprised to hear that he said special education services would not be touched? But even so, parents are still worried about what would happen to the funding without the DOE, right?
Right. So there are laws in place that designate how this money is spent, and those are still in place. The department cannot be shut down without full approval from Congress. So the things that the president are taking today, the EO is a direction to Linda McMahon saying begin the process of breaking down the education department. And so what is really happening today is they are just beginning to make some changes. More changes will be coming. What we know for sure is that the number of employees has been cut in half already. Some people have been let go. Some people took that fork in the road buyout. So definitely a reduction in bureaucracy and some changes within the department. But for now, much of it does remain the same.
Yeah, I appreciate you breaking it down, because certainly there's a lot to read and digest what it all means for the departments and for education moving forward. But it still needs final approval from Congress
to shut it down completely. Exactly. And you've had members of Congress today, including Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, saying that this is a code red for teachers and students and parents, and she's vowing to look deeply into this and to try to protect the education department. And there's been questions about whether lawsuits will be filed. So there's definitely people who are resistant to what the president is doing.
And so what is the timeline on something like this? An executive order is signed. It still needs the approval of Congress. So how soon do things happen?
For now, this EO just directs the Education Department to begin the process of unwinding. I haven't read copies of the exact details yet. I'm so eager to see what those details are so that we can get facts out to everybody. But for now, we just don't know what the timeline is. It's just the beginning of the process.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking it down. I know that you have a lot to digest, and then certainly you'll break it down for us again. Jennifer Jacobs. Jennifer, thank you. How safe are the bridges that you use every day? A live report next. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Nearly 1 year after a cargo ship struck the Baltimore Francis Scott Key Bridge, triggering its collapse and killing 6 people, the NTSB issues an urgent safety recommendation. So CBS News senior transportation correspondent Chris Van Cleve joining us now. Chris, thanks for being here. You know, so many Americans drive over bridges each and every day, the Golden Gate Bridge directly behind you. What needs to be done to make sure these bridges are safe?
Well, the NTSB says fundamentally an assessment that has been recommended since 1991 needs to be done. And that's basically a series of math problems to figure out what level of risk those 68 bridges would have in the event of a vessel strike, meaning they got hit by a large vessel like a cargo ship, as we saw play out in Baltimore. And these are significant bridges. We're talking about the Golden Gate Bridge, the Coronado Bridge in San Diego, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland. These are significant bridges. We're talking about millions of people that drive across these 68 bridges every day. So to not know the answer to that vulnerability, the NTSB feels presents an urgent safety risk. Just the not knowing is significant enough to push the owners of those bridges to take action.
Yeah, Chris, the NTSB said this assessment really is nothing new. So what went wrong here, and why have so many of the country's most traveled bridges never been assessed for collision?
Well, so this assessment criteria is put together by the Association of Transportation Authorities, basically. It is not a federal regulation. So there's not a mandate to do it on bridges older than 1991, bridges that were built before 1991. So there was no enforcement mechanism to be done. Now, the NTSB says had the Maryland Transportation Authority done this calculation, they would have known the Francis Scott Key Bridge was 30 times over the acceptable risk threshold for a collision, and could then have taken action to build in the protections around that bridge to prevent something like this from happening. And, you know, we visited a bridge about 90 minutes from that one that is doing that project right now, spending almost $100 million to protect the bridge against a potential strike from a large cargo ship, because they knew their bridge might not withstand that kind of impact.
All right, it is an urgent safety recommendation by the NTSB. Chris Van Cleve, thank you so much. America Decides is next with exclusive new reporting on deportation flights, also the executive order signed by the president. Major Garrett is next. You're watching CBS News 24/7.